it's Mark Cunningham at Grace Property Management. Well, if you're a landlord or a housing provider or a tenant in Colorado, you need to be aware of a new piece of legislation that was passed and how it impacts you, whether you're the housing provider or whether you are the applicant. Now, this is HB 25-1236, and it changes the rules for applicants when they're applying to rent a property with the housing provider or the landlord. Now, the name of the bill for HB 25-1236 is concerning the screening of a prospective residential tenant, also known as an applicant, by the landlord. It changes the rules of the applicant submitting a rental application. See, at the last legislative session, the legislature passed a bill, and it had to do with what was called PTSRs, Portable Tenant Screening Reports. Now, we went into depth on a prior video on this from the last legislative session, but what it said is this. Gosh, it costs a lot of money for these applicants to keep paying application fees to different landlords. So let's allow these applicants to submit their applicant background report and credit report directly to the landlord. But we want to ensure that it's legitimate, that there's no opportunities for fraud or abuse with this. So what we're going to say, and this is what the legislation said, is that the PTSR has to come directly from TransUnion, has to come directly from a third party. The tenant can't walk in, or the applicant can't walk in and say, here you go, here's my report, because they could potentially have manipulated that. So it's got to come from a third-party provider. That's what the prior law said. Well, it created some problems because TransUnion, Experian, other places like that, they have federal laws they have to follow. And these federal laws say we can't give your applicant's background report directly to a third party without your permission and without knowing who that third party is. So we as a company, Grace Management, we have to be approved through TransUnion to get those. So it created a lot of red tape, and it kind of didn't work. So one thing that this new bill does is it has repealed language in the bill they passed last legislation that allows us as the landlords to require the applicant to make the screening report directly available to us, the landlord, through a consumer reporting agency or a third-party website. Meaning that now under this new bill, the applicant can walk directly into my office or your office and say, here you go. Here is my background report, and you have to accept it directly from them. Previously, you could say, well, I can't take this from you. I need to get it directly from Experian or TransUnion or a third-party provider. Now you are required by this new law to say, okay, great, and accept it as they provide it to you. Now, it does some other things as well, and at the end, I'll explain kind of what this means on a practical standpoint. But in addition to that, if that applicant who walks into your property is subsidized, Section 8, any type of a subsidized housing applicant, it changes the rules a little bit. Because the PTSR, the Portable Tenant Screening Report, in order to be legitimate, it has to have a certain amount of information. It has to have their background, has to have their credit, has to have all that. Unless they're subsidized. This new bill specifically says that if a subsidized applicant submits a PTSR, the PTSR is not required to include their credit history, their credit score, or any adverse credit events. Now, if that leaves you scratching your head, it does me as well, because that's kind of the whole point of the credit report, is to find out their credit score. But if they're subsidized, it doesn't have to include their credit score or credit history or any adverse credit events. Okay. Now, keep in mind, by the way, you are required by law, as we talked about in the last bill we looked at, to accept housing subsidies. So what you can't do is say, well, oh, you're subsidized, Mr. Applicant? No, I don't accept subsidies. Yes, you do. You are required by law to accept subsidies, and then if they bring in the PTSR, you can't require that PTSR to contain information about their credit. It goes on to say that the landlord must accept PTSR reports directly from the applicant. I'm sorry, it doesn't say this. This is the practical application. Okay, this is how you as a housing provider or as a landlord would work through this. You're required to accept it, but you do not have to make your decision to approve or decline based upon that. Meaning, if you're a housing provider, you can still pull your own credit report on that applicant. You just can't charge them for it. So if an applicant has a screening report, you're required by law to accept it. You can still go have them fill out your own application, pull your own background reports, but you can't make them pay for that. You can't charge them anything for that. little bit of a complex bill, changes the rules around. Now, if you're a client of Grace Property Management, know that we are compliant with this, and the way we're operating is we're still requiring those applicants who come in with a PTSR, whether they're subsidized or not, we are still pulling as we can legally the background report. There are certain things, if they're subsidized, we cannot consider, which is the things that talked about in that bill. So on a subsidized tenant, you as a landlord are not legally allowed to look at their applicant credit score. It's illegal. So that gets very complicated, but know that we as your property management company are doing everything under the umbrella of the law that we're able to do to ensure that we're placing qualified applicants into your property. If you're not a client of Grace Property Management, reach out to us. But this goes into effect January 1 of 2026, so you have a little bit of time, and it applies to all property owners. So if you're a one-person landlord, you own one little property, you think, oh, this doesn't apply to me, right? Yes, it does. It applies to Grace Property Management, just as it applies to the self-managing landlord of your property. If we can be of assistance, consider us a resource. Feel free to visit our website, rentgrace.com. You can get information on some of these other bills that have passed, and we wish you success.